My name is Fiona. I'm the yarn spinner, and yarn is another word for story. And as you can see, when I tell stories, I do it with stuff, mainly with puppets. And the stories I'm telling this afternoon are stories from the Isle of Man. Now, has anybody here been to the Isle of Man? No? Well, we tend to think of it off to the side. Actually, if you look at it on a map, the Isle of Man is in the heart of Britain. It's surrounded by the sea, but also by Wales and England and Scotland and Ireland. And there it is, splat in the middle of the sea between them all. And the Isle of Man is a separate country. It's got its own laws. It's got its own parliament, Tynwald. It's got its own traditions, and it's got its own folklore. Lots of folklore. It's got a fair-sized human population. But in the past, it seemed to have had an even bigger population of all kinds of mysterious and magical creatures. Creatures like Glashtan, the water horse, Ushtis that can transform themselves, Begins, which are a hideous goblin-like creature, Fenudri, a hairy trollman, and of course, best known of all, fairies. Now, when the Isle of Man people talk about the fairies, they don't mean twinkly little Victorian glittery things. Fairies on the Isle of Man are so tall. They dress in red and green and brown, and they like to cause mischief. They can be helpful, but mostly they cause mischief. So the Manx people are really polite to the fairies. For a start, they mainly don't call them the fairies. They call them themselves, or the little people, or the winds. Anything except fairies. Even today, when all the other folklore traditions are being forgotten, the fairies are remembered. If you go down from Douglas to Castletown, you cross Fairy Bridge. On that bridge, certainly up until March of this year, hanging around on the trees, ribbons, notes asking favours, requests from the fairies. So the fairies are very important on the Isle of Man. And this afternoon I'm telling stories about all of those creatures. Now I'll probably tell stories for about 50 minutes to an hour. Some of you have got younger ones with you. I know they do not have the attention span for that long. I am not in the least offended if some of you need to leave sooner. I absolutely understand it. Just slide out at the end of a story. But hopefully most of you can stay for most of the set. Now, I'm going to start with a story about how the Isle of Man was made. And I'm going to get a friend of mine to start us off. If you want to know about the past, ask somebody old. That's what I was told when I first hatched out of an egg millions of years ago. I've lived a very long time. I've seen things you wouldn't believe. I could tell you, but you wouldn't believe them, so what's the point? I could tell you how the Isle of Man was made. Go on then. Well, I suppose I could. I saw it happen. Long ago, when the world was young, there were giants. They came along just as my people were fading out and humans were taking over. And the giants fought. They made us dinosaurs look like pussycats. I quite fancy a nice pussycat right now. Very tasty. Who am I kidding? I'm old and slow and pussycats is quick. I eat grass now. It doesn't run away. Where was I? Giants? Oh, I'm getting sleepy. You tell the story, just as I told you, how I saw it happen. Long ago, when the world was young, there were giants, and two giants in particular in our stories. One was Finn McCool. He was a giant who lived in Ireland. And there was a giant across the sea in Scotland, a huge, fierce fellow. And Finn McCool and the Scottish giant would often shout and argue across the sea. And one day their argument got very fierce. They started a sod fight. They would pick up great lumps, sods of earth, and throw them across the sea at each other. Well, a Scottish giant said something so rude to Finn McCool. I'm not going to repeat it in front of a room full of children. But Finn McCool was furious. He pulled up a lump of earth that was absolutely enormous. The lump he pulled up was so big, the hollow it left in the ground filled up with water and became Loch Ness in Ireland. And he swung it round his head, and he let it go with all his might across the sea towards the Scottish giant. It was so big and heavy it landed in the sea, and it became the Isle of Man. And once the island was there, perhaps because it's been created by the giants and with such force, creatures came to live on it. And when Manannán Mac Lir was the son of the sea and the first ruler of man, he was a wizard so powerful he could make one man standing on the battlements at Peel Castle look like 100 fighting men. And if trouble came towards the island, he would throw a cloak of mist over it, Manannán's cloak, and people would just sail past without landing. Of course, he couldn't always see trouble coming, and one day he was on top of the mountain, Mount Brule. He looked down, and in Peel Harbour, the Viking longships had come to attack the island. Well, Manannán wanted to get down to the sea quickly to deal with the invaders, and he knew he couldn't run as fast as a wheel could roll. So he changed his shape into the shape of a circle with 3 legs and no body, and he rolled down the mountain, and he came to rest beside a stream. And then he turned back into human form, and the stream had lots of rushes growing on it. So he pulled up some of the rushes and he snapped them into bits, and he threw these onto the stream, just so we might make little boats out of them. And these bits of rush floated down into the harbour, and by his magic, Manannán made these little bits of rush look like ships full of fighting men. And the Vikings saw all these ships coming down the stream towards them filled with fighting men, and they turned and they fled. They didn't come back for a long while. And so Manannán used magic rather than weapons to protect the island, and perhaps because of that, it became full of so many magical creatures. Thank you. Now, there was once a fiddler, a man who played the fiddle, the violin. And he made his living long ago wandering round the island on foot, and he would play for weddings and funerals and parties. And he would earn a penny here and a penny there. He could live on it, but he wanted to buy a little bit of cottage and a patch of land so he could marry and support a wife. But he couldn't think of any way to do it when all you're earning is a little bit here and there for playing. Well, one day he'd been playing at an evening party in Ballasalla, and he had to go home at the end of the night, and he was tired. Normally, he took the long route home, but this time he was too tired. He went over the top of Fairy Hill. When he got up there, there was a circle of standing stones, bigger than me. Sitting on the top of one of the stones was one of the little people. A little man, 3 foot high, about 1 meter high, playing a flute. And the music he played was so beautiful, the fiddler just had to stop and get out his violin and start to play. And for an hour, the two of them played together, jigs and reels and country dances. At the end of that time, the little man said, "You're a fine fiddler, my fellow. If you come and play for us next week at our party, this time next week, I'll give you a bag of gold." And the little man just vanished. Well, the fiddler wasn't sure what to do. Everybody knew it was dangerous to mix with the little people. But when was he going to get a chance to earn a bag of gold again? All week he couldn't decide, should he go, should he stay, should he go, should he stay? A week later he was playing at another party and he made up his mind he was going to go and play the fiddle for the fairies. And he told his friends what he was doing. They said, don't go, it's dangerous. But he was determined to go. So they said, well, if you're going to go, at least promise us you won't eat anything while you're with the little people. You won't drink anything while you're there. It's dangerous. Well, the man didn't see what the fuss was about, but to keep his friends happy, he made that promise. And then off he went up to the top of Fairy Hill. When he got there, there was the little man sitting on one of the big standing stones playing the flute. And he looked at the young fiddler and said, you've come then. And he handed him a bag of gold. And the fiddler put the gold in his pocket. And he got out his fiddle. And he began to play. And as soon as he started to play, suddenly in the circle of stones, all kinds of magical creatures appeared. Some of the smaller fairies, the little people, fierce-faced, clad in plain clothing. Some of the tall, elven people, more human-like, more elegantly dressed. All of them leaping and dancing in turn to the music. And he played, and he played, and he played jigs and reels and country dances. And then his arms got tired. It was well into the middle of the night, and he'd already played at one party that night. And he stopped for a rest. And as soon as he did, all the little people started to crowd around him. And they started to offer him drinks and to offer him food. He was about to take something because the drinks and the food were like nothing he'd seen before. It was exciting. And then on the far side of the stone circle, he saw there was a group of old men, greying. Their clothes were ragged and tattered. They were shaking their heads at him as his hand reached towards the food. And he remembered his promise to his friends not to eat or drink. He refused the food. And as soon as he did, the fairies got angry. Because, you see, they knew if he ate or drank while he was with them, he would be trapped in their world forever. He was such a good fiddle player, they wanted him always at their beck and call to play when they wanted it. But if he didn't eat, he wouldn't be trapped there. Well, the fairies were clutching at him and pushing at him. And the only way to stop them was to play the fiddle again. On he played until he could not move his arms anymore. He stopped for another rest. Every time he stopped to rest, the fairies crowded round him, trying to get him to take food and take drink. And he would have to play again. And just before dawn, he could play no more. He was exhausted. The bow dropped to the grass beside him on one side, the fiddle to the other. Suddenly the fairies piled onto him. They were trying to get him to eat so that he had to stay with them. And he reached out with one hand. He could just feel his fiddle. And he plucked one string on the fiddle, and a note sounded clear and clean. And as soon as that note sounded, the fairies all thought he would be about to play again. They leapt back into the circle, leaving him alone, the fruit not having gone into his mouth. And at that moment, the sun came up. The fairy folk vanished, and the fiddler was free. Well, he still had his bow, and he still had his fiddle. And when he checked in his pocket, he still had the bag of gold. And it was gold. It hadn't turned to dust in the morning light. He went back to his cottage, and he slept all day, exhausted. And that night, his friends came round to see how he'd got on, going to play for the fairy folk. And he told them what had happened. He said, the thing I don't understand is those men on the other side of the circle of stones. There were several of them, and we were all bigger than the fairies. If they'd joined me, we could have fought off the fairy folk. We could have worked together. But his friends said, those were the prisoners of the fairy folk. They were the people who did eat and drink when they were with the little people. And they're the prisoners of the fairies, and they cannot fight them. They don't have the power. All they could do was warn you not to make the same mistake. And that was what they did. Well, the young man bought the cottage and the patch of land and got married, and he carried on making a living wandering around the island, playing for weddings and parties and funerals, earning a penny here and a penny there. But from then on, no matter how tired he got, he never took the shortcut over Fairy Hill. He always took the long route home because he didn't want to get into any more trouble with the little people. Thank you. Well, this next story is the story of the Fynoderee. But it starts with an elf. And like all elves, the elf in our story is handsome beyond compare. But he's also very friendly. Hello. Always ready to say hello or give a helping hand or a friendly wave. Well, this little elf was also in love. He'd been walking through the glen one day and he had seen a human girl, a Manx maiden. And he fell deeply in love with her. Well, of course, the maiden at first didn't want to do anything to do with him. Humans knew it was dangerous to mix with the elves and the little people. But the little elf was so kind and so charming. Eventually, the two of them fell deeply in love. And they would spend their days walking hand in hand, barefoot on the beach at Laxey Harbour, or they would picnic together up on Snaefell Mountain. And always the little elf would sing for his love. La 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 la. For elves and fairies have voices as beautiful as the morning lark. But, and you just knew there was going to be a but, didn't you? Trouble came at the time of the Harvest Moon Festival. Every year in the autumn, the king of the elves gave a great feast for all the little people and the elves and magical creatures on the island. It went on for days, and it was like Christmas and Easter and your birthday and the holidays and the weekend all rolled into one. And the little people looked forward to it all year. And normally the little elf looked forward to it too, but this time he wasn't so sure. If I go to the party, I have to leave my beautiful maiden. I can't take a human with me. I'll be gone for days. What should I do? And as he was thinking about this, another fairy in the form of a fox cub came past him. For elves and fairies can change their shape as easily as you or I would put on a hat or a coat. And just as he was going past, this fairy heard the elf go, "Hang the Harvest Moon Festival. I'm not going, I'm going to stay with my girlfriend." The fox fairy was shocked. And he ran. And he found the High King of the elves. And he told him what the little elf had said. Well, when he heard that, the king of the elves was furious. How dare he? How dare he refuse to come to my party, to stay with a human? I'll punish him for this. I'll change his shape into something hideous, and I'll take away his power to change himself back. And that was what he did. He used his magic on the little elf. Well, the next day, the maiden went up to the meadow to wait to meet her beautiful little elf. She couldn't wait to see him again. She was so happy she was even singing, in Manx, of course. O Graima Cree, O Valú Merem, O Graima Cree, O Valú Stúst, as Manach Noam Graima Cree Merem, sein thou erst gelden best fagush. But when the little elf appeared, he was not as she remembered him at all. He was now huge, and hairy and terrifying. His beautiful little white teeth were now great dirty tusks. He was covered in fur, and when he tried to speak or to sing to show that it was him, he wasn't used to the new shape of his mouth and his teeth and his tusks, and it just came out as roar. And the maiden was terrified, and she ran away back to her cottage and locked the door, leaving the little elf, I can now tell you, had been turned into a creature called a Fynoderee, all alone and broken-hearted. Well, to try and help him to forget his lost love, the Fynoderee started to help out the people on the island. He would help them get the crops in if a storm was coming. And if somebody was trying to build a farm or a house and there was a big rock in the way, he would move it because he was very strong. But he got a bit carried away. One night he saw a blizzard was coming, and some of his neighbouring farmers' little white sheep were still out on the mountainside. So he went and he rounded them up. But in the dark and the confusion and the blizzard, he got a bit confused. And the next day, when the farmer saw the Fynoderee, the poor creature was exhausted. "I didn't have too much trouble catching those little white sheep of yours, but those native sheep, your brown Lochtan sheep, that one sheep I had to chase 3 times round the mountain to catch it and to put it into the barn. Never again." The farmer was a little puzzled because he didn't have any brown native Lochtan sheep. He only had fluffy white ones. He went to look, and there, asleep in the sheep, was an exhausted hare. In his enthusiasm and the confusion of the blizzard, the Fynoderee had chased the fastest creature round the island, on the island 3 times round the mountain to catch it and get it safe. But all this distraction didn't help. The Fynoderee was still broken-hearted, and one day he just disappeared. Some people say he left the island to go in search of somebody who could use magic to change him back into his original shape. He wasn't seen there again. But by now, of course, the Manx maiden had realised that the person she had run away from was her lovely elf. And she felt terrible. And she would sit looking out to sea, waiting for him to come back, and as she waited, she wept. Well, as all this was going on, although to you and me the noise she made weeping was no louder than the squeak of a little mouse, to the elves and the fairies it was like 10,000 brass bands all playing at once. And the king of the elves felt bad, because in punishing the little elf who did owe him obedience, he had punished this human as well, who owed him nothing. And eventually he went to see the maiden, and he said, "Do not weep, fair maid. There is nothing done by magic that cannot be undone. I cannot lift the spell that I placed on your little elf, but somewhere, one day, he will find somebody who can. But there is a problem. Elves and fairies live forever and a day, and mortals like you do not. So I will use my magic on you. You shall not age another day, nor shall you die until your little elf returns to you." And so it was. The maiden has never got any older from that day to this, and still she sits at the coast of the island looking out to sea. Some people say they've seen her on the cliff tops at Peel, others on the rocks at Port Erin, still waiting to be reunited with the one she loves, because she too is broken-hearted. But she knows that when he comes back, their two hearts will be joined again, and they won't be lonely anymore. Thank you. Well, this next story is about one of the animals people know quite well on the island. It's about Manx cats. Now, hands up if any of the younger ones can tell me what's the one thing we all know about Manx cats. Who knows what's unusual about Manx cats? Yes? They don't have a tail. Absolutely. Here you are, a little something for getting an answer right. Manx cats don't have tails. They look a bit like that. They've got high, taller back legs, their rump sticks up, and there isn't a tail. Well, there are lots of stories on the island about why Manx cats don't have tails. But I'm going to tell a story about that with Vikings in, because I like this one. So I need a volunteer to come up and be a Viking. Who's willing to come up? Your hand was up very quickly, young lady. Will you stand here for me? Just stand there. Right. Now, I'm going to kit you out in what you need to be my Viking. So, can I put that on your head? And can I give you that? Right. Well, this is the story of Vikings and why Manx cats have no tail. And long ago on the Isle of Man, all the cats were like cats everywhere. And they all had beautiful, long, elegant tails. Then the Vikings came. Vikings were cruel and fast and terrible. Can you look cruel and terrible for me? Oh, brilliant. Now I'm scared. They were also, believe it or not, really into fashion. They liked to have nice embroidered tunics. They liked fancy axes, nothing plain, nice decorated axes. And they liked to decorate their Viking helmets with cat tails. A cat-tailed helmet was the latest Viking must-have accessory. And they didn't want just one tail, they wanted as many as they could fit on the helmet. So when they came to the Isle of Man, if they saw a cat going past with a beautiful tail, might I borrow your axe, please? I won't make you be the cruel person who does this. They would see the cat and go and chop it off, and then they would take the tail and fix it onto the helmet. Can you give us a twirl? Can you turn around on the spot so that people can see? This Viking now has a full set of cat's tails. Well, I have to say they didn't always do it very neatly like that, and they certainly didn't take the kittens to the vet and get anaesthetic for them. They hacked. Sometimes they got the tail, sometimes they got the head, sometimes they just chopped the cat in two. The mother cats got decidedly sick of this. They didn't figure out that they'd had kittens just so a Viking could come along and chop the tail off with an axe. And the kittens weren't living very long. So the mother cats started to chew the tails off the kittens as soon as they were born. Because a cat without a tail could walk past a Viking in perfect safety. And gradually the cats came to be born with no tails at all. Well, times have changed. Vikings and their helmets are no longer in fashion. But Manx cats will always be unique, precisely because they don't have beautiful, long, elegant tails. Take a bow with me. Thank you. Hang on. Don't go without your reward, young lady. Now, after a story about a cat, it's time for a story about a dog. The black dog of Peel, the Moreth Dhu. And in Peel, which is on the coast, there is a castle. It's in ruins now, although I have to say pretty impressive ruins. You can still walk around it and see all the buildings. But for hundreds of years, it was a garrison. There were soldiers living there and working there. And as you go in through the gates, and they are huge, you go in through the gates, And on the right, there is the guard room. That was the room that the guards would use if they were on duty but not actually doing anything at the time. And in that room, there was a fireplace and a table and a couple of benches, very, very basic. But the men used to gather there. Now, one of their jobs of the guards would be to shut the gates of the castle at dusk and lock the gates and carry the key to the captain of the guard. Well, I said it was on the coast. It's pretty bleak in winter. Wind and rain howling between the buildings. And so they didn't like going through the buildings, round the buildings, to get to the captain of the guard's room. There was a dark underground passage that came up in the guard room, and if you went through it, at the other end, it went under another building, and it came out near the captain of the guard's room. So, of course, particularly in winter, the guards would always take the key through the underground passage, and they took it in turns. Well, that was fine for years. And then one day, out of the dark underground passage came a big black dog. Its coat was long and curly. Its eyes were red. Nobody knew where it had come from. It didn't seem to belong to anybody. Nobody ever saw it eat or drink. It would just come into the guard room as it got dark and lie in front of the fire. And somehow it made the men a bit nervous. It was completely silent. It never barked, and that was weird in a dog. And when the black dog was in the room, in the guard room with them, the guards tended to be a little bit quieter, more polite, better behaved, didn't like to shout too much or swear too much. And then at dawn it would get up and go back into the dark underground passage. And the men got a bit nervous about going through this underground tunnel on their own. They started to go through in pairs when they were taking the key to the captain of the guards at the end of the day. That was all right. Nothing happened. That was okay. And then one day, one of the guards had been off duty in the town. And he came back just as they were shutting the gates and about to lock it. He got through the gate, and the other guards started to turn the lock, and he said, "I'll take the key to the captain of the guards." He had had rather a lot to drink. Now, I'm afraid, children, when grown-ups have too much to drink, they very often think they can do a lot more than they really can do, and they can do things better than they really can do, whereas actually when you've had too much alcohol, you're not very good at most things, even if you can do them when you're sober. But this guard had had too much to drink. And his friend said, "Don't be silly, you're not on duty and you're drunk. If they see you like this, you'll get into trouble. We'll take the key back, it's our turn." "No," he said. By this time he'd wobbled his way into the guard room, and the black dog was in front of the fire. "I'm not scared of the big black dog. I'll take the key to the captain of the guard." And they said, "No, really don't. What about the dog?" "I'm not scared of the big black dog." And he kicked the dog. And the other guards went silent. He grabbed the key and he went into the underground passage. And after a moment, the big black dog stood up and followed the guard into the underground passage. And the other guards were looking at each other. You know that moment when you think you ought to do something, but you don't quite know what the something is. A few moments later, there was a scream and a howl. And a moment or two after that, out came the drunken guard. His face was white with fear. His hair was standing on end and turned grey with fright. And he was so terrified, he couldn't speak clearly to explain what happened. He died after 3 days, and nobody knew what happened in the underground passage. There was no sign of the big black dog. But after that, nobody wanted to go through that passage to take the key to the captain of the guards. Not in twos, not in fours, not in whole battalions. They bricked up the underground passage where it came into the guard room, and everybody else said, "Well, now, when you're in the guard room, you can relax, can't you?" Of course, they didn't relax. They would sit and they would look at the bricked up wall, wondering when and if the big black dog was going to just mysteriously come right back through into the guard room. Thank you. Well, for this next story, I need some volunteers. I need 6 volunteers, if I can muster 6. Let me see. You in the Furby top, and you 2, 3. Who else have we got? 4, 5, 6. Right. So, can I have you at this end? Would that be all right? Yeah. Littler ones down the other end. That's great. So you in the middle. That's it. Down here. Yeah. Yes. Can you go down to that end, young man? Right. And I'll give you the bits and pieces you need for us to tell this story. Now, can you put that on your finger? It's a chicken puppet. Can you put the duck on your finger? And the rabbit, can you put your finger in there? Right. Now, can you take the lamb, so you can put your hand in through her stomach. And if you take the goat, and again you get into there. And if you'll take the wild boar for me, he's not a puppet, but you'll see what you need to go do with him as we go along. Okay, so this is a story from the Isle of Man. It sounds really modern. It is a very old story. And it's the story of Jack the Giant Killer. And there was once a boy whose name was Jack. And he liked to fight. He lived on a farm in the north of the island with his mother and his brothers. His father was away at the fishing most of the time, so his mother had to look after the farm and raise the boys. It did not always go very well, because she had an awful lot to do. So the boys did pretty much what they liked, and what Jack liked to do was fight. Well, when Jack was 4, he went out into the farmyard, and he had a fight with a chicken. And he won, because a 4-year-old is bigger than a chicken. And his mother said, "Aren't you clever and aren't you strong?" This was not a good idea. So he kept fighting. When he was 6, he went out into the farmyard and he had a fight with a duck. And he won, because he was getting bigger. And ducks aren't that big either. And when he was 8, he was out there in the fields fighting with the rabbits. And winning. And his mother was going, "Aren't you clever and aren't you strong? But maybe you should leave the little animals and the poultry alone now, dear." He'd stopped listening. By the time he was 10, he was out in the fields fighting with the lambs. And winning, although this lamb's putting up a very good fight, I have to say. By the time he was 12, he took on the family goat. And won. Mainly because by now he was using a big stick. And the goat didn't like the look of it. His mother didn't say very much at all, because she didn't like the look of the big stick either. So by the time he was 14, everybody in the area was coming to have a fight with him, to see who was stronger. All the boys his age and some of the men, and he always won, because he was strong. But then he started picking fights with everybody. Now, I don't mean boys his own age to see who was stronger. I mean little children on the way to their first day of school. Grannies coming back from market with baskets of eggs. He was a menace. These days they'd have given him an Asbo, but back then they gave him a nickname, Jack the Giant Killer, because he thought he could fight and kill anything. His mother thought he wasn't much use for anything except catching the wild pigs, the poor moors, up on the mountainside. Well, around this time, a great big wild boar moved into the area, and he started to attack anybody who crossed what he saw as his territory, which was in fact the whole district. So now people were going around in 2s and 3s. They had to avoid the wild boar. They had to avoid Jack and his big stick. Life was tricky, but Jack decided to do something about it. Jack said, "I can kill the wild boar. I bet I can kill the wild boar." And he went off to look for the wild boar. Had quite a long walk to find it. There it was, in the mud beside a river. And when the wild boar saw him, it roared. And it stood up and it charged towards him. And he hit it with his stick, and it fell over. And he went, "I've killed the wild boar, I've killed the wild boar." He hadn't. He looked round, the wild boar was back on its feet. It was charging again. And he hit it with his stick again, it fell over. "I've killed the wild boar, I've killed the wild boar." He hadn't. While he was bouncing around going, "I've killed the wild boar was charging at him again, and this time it caught him in the leg. A final blow with the stick killed the wild boar. "I've killed the wild boar, I've killed the..." Oh. He looked down and realised that the wild boar had caught his leg deeply with its tusk. He was bleeding and he had to stumble home using his stick to help him balance. He fell over a couple of times. He got dirt in the wound. And although he got home, he was very ill. And after that, he had to turn his big stick into a crutch to help him to work and to walk. And everybody in the district came to see his mother and said how grateful they were to Jack for killing the wild boar that was causing them all so much trouble. Secretly, they were very grateful to the wild boar for slowing Jack down a bit, because now he couldn't go around picking fights, and the whole neighbourhood was much more peaceful from then on. Take a bow, all of you. Thank you. Do you want to pile them all up over there? That's it, and here you are. Oops, so sorry. This is why I use wrapped chocolate. Here you are.
Thank you.
There you go, young man, and you can sit back down now. Thank you. Well, that's the story of Jack the Giant Killer. And the story I'm about to tell next is one of the best known on the island. Sadly, a lot of the stories from the Isle of Man aren't well known on the island. I think people from Wales would have some sympathy. For a long time they were repressed. People weren't supposed to speak the language, the Manx language, and they weren't supposed to tell the story. So a lot of the stories got buried in the past. And there's only a few people out there telling some of these tales. But this one is well known. And it's the story of the Begin of St. Trinians. And a Begin is a hideous, goblin-like, nasty creature. And the Begin of St. Trinians is the worst of the lot. And up in the north of the island, there is a church called St. Trinians without a roof. And this is the story of the Begin of St. Trinians. Long ago, a merchant was at sea. He was travelling the world, trading things, buying and selling. He was caught in a terrible storm. And he said to God, "If I can survive this storm, I will send money home to build a church in the village I was born in," because it had no church. People had to walk miles on a Sunday to get to church. Well, the man survived the storm and he kept his promise. He sent money back to his village in the north of the island to build a church. And the people who lived there were delighted, and they picked a patch of ground to build on. What they didn't know was they picked the ground that was above where a Begin lived. And they started to build the walls of this church. But the Begin did not want a church bell tolling over his head every Sunday morning. He wanted to stop it. And they got the walls built all right, and they started to put the roof on it. But just when there was only one day's work left to do on the roof, when there was just a little bit of roof left to do, the night before the church would have been finished, up through the floor of the church came the hideous Begin. And he pushed up with his hands and he brought the roof beams crashing down, and he gave a terrible And the next morning everybody came and looked at the mess. They were determined to try again. They wanted their church and it needed a roof. So they did the work again. They put the roof back onto the church, and when there was just one day's work left to do, up through the floor of the church came the Begin, pushing up the roof beams, pulling down the roof. And nobody knew what to do. I mean, this could just go on forever. They build the roof, he pulls it down. They build the roof, he puts it down. Somebody had an idea. It was perhaps if somebody would spend the night in the church, that last night before it's finished, then we could get the church finished. The Begin might keep away, and And we can have the bishop on standby to come and bless the church and consecrate the church land. And then the Beguine wouldn't be able to come up and do any more harm. He wouldn't be able to go on to land that had been blessed. Well, it's one of those great ideas, but nobody wants to be it. No one wants to be the person who spends the night in the church with the Beguine appearing up through the floor. But there was a young man called Timothy. He was a tailor. He made clothes, and in those days you made them by hand, no machines. Every stitch was done by hand. He needed some money. He wanted to get married. And he wanted there to be a church. So he said, all right, I'll go into the church the night before it's due to be finished, and I'll stay there and keep the Beguine away. But I need to earn some money. So how about, who'll have a bet with me? Who'll bet me that I can make a whole pair of breeches, of trousers, in one night by hand? Well, nobody thought you could do that. Not when you're waiting for something terrible to happen and working in the dark by candlelight. So quite a few people took the bet. Sure enough, they did more work on the church roof when there was just one day's work left to do. At the end of that day, Timothy went into the church. And he took candles with him so he could see to work, and he took patterns and materials, scissors, pins, thread, tape measure. And he sat there, surrounded by candles. He cut out the fabric and he pinned it together, and then he tapped it, and then he started to stitch it. And he worked all night. You know, when you're busy, you forget the time, actually. You forget that stuff might be about to happen. And he was working so hard trying to finish the pair of breeches, he almost forgot the Beguine. And just before dawn, he realised the Beguine hadn't come and it must be working. And as he thought that, up through the floor of the old church came a huge, hideous, horned head. And when it had got to the neck so it was free to speak, the great eyes glared at Timothy and said, "See my great head, little man, my large eyes, my sharp teeth." I see, said Timothy, who was not looking at the Beguine at all. He was much too terrified. He was concentrating on doing the last few stitches. He only had one little bit of seam left to do. Well, being ignored made the Beguine even angrier. More of him rose up through the floor. Now the whole body and hands and arms were showing. "See my great body, little man, my large hands, my sharp claws." I see, said Timothy, still not looking, still stitching away. More of the Beguine came up through the floor until the whole creature was there in front of him, his horned feet tapping on the cobbles in the church. "See my great legs, little man, my sharp hooves, my large..." But before the creature could say the word tail, Timothy had put the last stitch in the breeches and looked up and saw that the Beguine was pushing up on the roof beams. Well, Timothy turned with the trousers over his shoulders and he ran out through the door. And as he reached the shelter of the doorway and the arch of the door, the roof came down with the Beguine going, "Yeah, ha, 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 ha." And Timothy ran, and he ran, and he ran, and he ran, and he ran all the way across the fields to the next village and the next church. And he knew he wasn't going to get to the church in time because he could feel this great creature chasing after him, its jaws snapping like that as if it wanted to swallow him whole. So when he got within reach of the churchyard, Timothy leapt over the wall onto the churchyard of the neighbouring church, and now he was standing on holy ground, ground that had been blessed. He knew the Beguine couldn't follow him, but the Beguine was so angry it pulled off its own head and flung it at Timothy, and it exploded with a horrible green gloopy blah all over him. Well, amazingly, Timothy survived, although after that he was always a little twitchy, a little nervy, and a little bit more grey around the edges than he had been before. But he won his bet, because if the last few stitches weren't very neat, he had finished the breeches, and everybody knew they wouldn't have done a neater job with the hideous Beguine raising up through the floor. But as for the church at St. Trinian's, it stands roofless to this day. Nobody's ever tried to put the roof on it again, in case the Beguine comes back. Thank you. Well, this next one, any of you here old enough to remember playing a game that would predict who you might marry? When I was a kid, you used to play it with fruit pips. If you were having something like plums and you had little plum stones in your pudding, we used to play Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Sailor. Anybody else remember playing that? Wonderful, I'm not the only person here who goes back that far. Well, on the Isle of Man, they had a version of this called Goggins. On 12th night, which was the night before, well, it's the night we take down Christmas decorations here. It's 12 days of Christmas. And on 12th night, the teenage girls used to play a game a bit like that to predict who they might marry. And they would get a whole string of cups like this called Goggins. And into each cup, they would place an object that might represent a profession. You wouldn't know who the person you'd marry would be, but you might know what profession they would be. And then they'd send somebody out of the room, one of the girls, and the rest would move all the cups around, and the girl would come back in blindfold and have to pick a cup. And one night, a group of girls were playing this on 12th night, and one came back in, and she got wool. So she was going to marry a shepherd. Another got a piece of fabric. She would be going to marry a tailor, a man who made clothes. Somebody else got a cross. They would be marrying a vicar. Somebody else got a little grain of corn. They would be married to a farmer. And one of them got a little piece of tin. A tin miner might be their future husband. But there was one girl, and I need one of the grown-up ladies. Would somebody mind coming up as a volunteer? It's perfectly safe, I promise. Thank you. The last girl to come back in put out her hand and picked a Goggins. And would you mind pulling that out? And when she pulled it out, it was a dead I'm not going to say the R-A-T word because they don't on the island. It's called longtails. It's terribly bad luck to use the R-A-T word. But it was a dead longtail. Thank you. Here you are. Why shouldn't grown-ups get a reward as well? And you can imagine what all the other girls were like. She's going to marry a dead rat. She's going to marry a dead rat. She's going to marry a dead rat. She had to put up with a lot of teasing for quite a while. But in the end, she had the last laugh. The other girls went on and they married shepherds and tailors and farmers. One married a vicar. One married a tin miner. But the girl who got the dead longtail, she married an undertaker, a man who deals with dead bodies. And being a profession that's always needed, he was the richest of the lot. So she had the last laugh in the end. Thank you. Right, now, I'm just going to tell, I've got time for 2 more stories. And this is about a Glashan. Now, Glashan is a water horse. Doesn't that sound pretty and lovely? It's not. This is a creature that lives in the sea. But it can change from man to horse and back again. And it comes onto the land at night, and it looks for beautiful young girls to drag them down to the sea and devour and destroy them. And Maggie, in our story, was a beautiful young girl. She lived in a cottage near the sea with her father. It was just the 2 of them. And one day, her father needed to go to the market in Douglas. And he said to his daughter all the things parents say to their children. Don't let a stranger in the house. Make sure you lock the door. Don't let anybody in but me. Don't go too far away from the farm. Well, Maggie started doing her chores around the farm. And then she heard a terrible storm coming in from the sea. So she got the cow in the barn, and she got the chickens into the chicken run. She couldn't catch the cockerel. They were feeding it up for their Christmas dinner. But this cockerel was not about to be caught. Not with a storm coming, not for any reason. She chased it round and round the farmyard, and eventually she gave up. She just put a bit of corn down in the porch for it and thought, well, it can shelter from the storm in the porch over the door. And she went inside, and the weather, when the storm broke, was so bad, her father couldn't come back from Douglas that night. He would have to stay over. And she thought that might be the case, but she made dinner for him anyway, and for herself. And when it was quite late, she had a knocking at the door. She was puzzled. She didn't think it would be her father. She went and she opened the door. The door had a terrible creak to it. And she kept meaning to oil it, and so did her father. But you know what those jobs around the house are like. You just get used to them after a while. You don't notice the sound. Well, when she got the door open, on the doorstep was a young man. He had a black velvet suit, and his face was quite long and thin and pale. He had dark black curly hair, but it was almost glued to his head from how wet he was. He'd been out in the storm. And Maggie was torn, because she knew you shouldn't invite a stranger into the house, especially when you're there on your own. But then how do you leave somebody on the doorstep in a terrible storm? The people of the island are very hospitable, and in the end, hospitality won. She asked the young man in. In he came. And she said he could sit beside the fire to dry out and dry off a bit. And she offered to share some dinner with him, but he refused. But when she turned away to wash up her own plate at the sink, she noticed his hand came out, and he took some sugar lumps from the bowl on the table. He took an apple from the shelf by the door, and Maggie got suspicious. Horses eat sugar lumps. Horses eat apples. Surely a human would have said yes to the offer of a warm supper. So when he was asleep, she crept over towards him, and when his hair had dried a bit, it was dry around his ears, and she blew the hair around his ears, and they parted, and she saw his ears were not round like ours, but pointed like a horse. She knew he was a Glashtan. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to run away, but she knew if she ran to the door and she tried to pull it open, it would creak, he would wake up, he would catch her. She thought the safest bet would be to just stay terribly still all night and hope he slept through till dawn, and surely at dawn he'd have to go into the sea again. She waited, and she waited. She wished it was dawn, but it was only about 3 o'clock in the morning. She waited and she waited. Suddenly the storm was right overhead. There was a great crash of thunder, and the Glashtan woke up. And he looked round. He could see from how Maggie was looking at him that she'd guessed what he was. And he wanted to get near enough to grab her. So he reached in his pocket and he got out a string of pearls, and he held them towards her, hoping she'd be foolish enough to grab them, and he could then have grabbed her. Maggie wasn't that stupid. As soon as he reached towards her with the pearls, she stood up and she ran for the door. It didn't matter now that the door creaked. She just had to get away. She pulled the door open. But before she got out of the door, he grabbed her arm and she screamed, which I won't because it will echo. But she screamed so loudly, she woke the cockerel asleep in the porch. And the little cockerel thought it must be morning, and he'd missed it, so he started going, cock-a-doodle-doo, 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 and then realised it was still the middle of the night. But by that time, the Glashtan had heard the crowing of the cockerel. He thought it must be morning, and he had to be back in the sea by dawn. He let go of Maggie's arm, and he galloped away. And as he ran away from the farm, Maggie saw him change. First of all, he looked like a person. Then he looked like a horse with the head of a person with long, pointed ears. It was the creepiest thing she had ever seen. She saw this half horse, half human galloping away. And as he got down towards the sea, he changed entirely into his horse form and sank down into the waves. Maggie grabbed the cockerel, pulled it into the cottage, and shut and locked the door, and stayed behind that door until her father got back the next day. And she had to tell him what had happened. And of course he was very cross with her for letting a stranger into the house when she was there on her own. But the one thing they could agree on was that the cockerel had saved Maggie's life, and he was never going to be Christmas dinner. From then on he had a fat, happy and very unuseful life, being fussed by both of them, because he had frightened away the Glashtan who had come to destroy Maggie. Thank you. I'm just going to finish with a very short story. It's about the island, and it's about a weaver, a man who weaves cloth. And this weaver was called Samuel, and he lived up in Laxey. And Samuel wanted to weave a cloth that would represent all the good things about the Isle of Man. He couldn't decide what colour to make it. So he thought, easy, I'll ask my friends. So he went and he asked his friend, who was a fisherman, and the fisherman said, oh, it's got to be blue, of course, blue for the sea that surrounds the island. And he asked his friend who was a shepherd, and the shepherd said, no, it's got to be green, green for the hills. And he asked the children said, it's got to be gold-coloured, the colour of the gorse, the colour of sunshine. When he asked his mother, she said, no, purple. Purple for the heather that covers the hills. Heather's magical, and we're lucky to live on this magical island with all of the magical creatures. His wife, when he asked her, finally, said, what about white? Because all the little cottages were white, and she loved her little home, and she wanted white to represent the cottages. Samuel didn't know what to do. He couldn't mix blue and green and white and purple and yellow. It was going to be horrible. They would just splurge. You couldn't have one colour like that. And he went out for a walk to clear his head, and he climbed up one of the hills, and he looked down. And he could see the blue sea and the green hills, the golden gorse, the purple heather, the little white cottages. And he thought, well, even if he could put them all in, it left out the little squares of farmers' fields. They were part of the landscape as well. And he thought, that's it. Squares. A tartan. He decided he would weave a tartan. And all the lines and all the colours would represent the different things. And they would make a pattern of tiny squares to represent the farmers' fields. And so he went home and he made the first Manx tartan. And it's been that way to this day. And it's blue for the sea and green for the hills, gold for the gorse, purple for the heather, white for the cottages, all forming a pattern of little squares like the farmers' fields. And it was woven to represent the best of the Isle of Man. And I hope that these stories have too. Thank you. Thank you very much, and for being here for so long. Thank you very much.